Hello and welcome to Newspeak. I'm Peter Whittle, and as usual, I'm happy to say, joined by Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, our senior fellow and royal historian, Amy Gallagher of NCF and Stand Up to Woke, and Dr. Philip Kiszely, other senior fellow, cultural historian, and indeed our national organiser now. That's a very beautiful segue there, I think, Philip, into we've got these, further locals events coming up. What's the news on those?
We have indeed. We've got one on the 20th, which is in Beaconsfield, and that's with Ben Habib. We've got a locals meet-up on the 22nd of March in Manchester. We've got Liverpool, which is an online event on the 24th. We've got Dorset, a locals meetup, which locals all know about, on the 25th of March. We've got Southampton as well on the 25th of March. And we've got a few events in April as well, so I'll read one or two of these out too. Okay, we've got a Sheffield meetup with guest speaker Paul Selby. That's on the 1st of April. Then we've got a Brighton meetup on the 8th, and we've got a meetup in Norwich on the 13th, and that's about EDI in the NHS, so that's going to be really interesting. If you're interested, email locals@newcultureforum.org.uk, and the events are free.
Great. You said one with Ben Habib.
Yes, there is. There's in Beaconsfield on the 20th of March.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Lovely. Highly topical. And it brings us right on.
Well, before we do that, I think we should all congratulate Peter for a very stellar performance at the Oxford Union recently.
Thank you.
Which was great. We just put the video out also on YouTube, and it's quite fun to watch and an invigorating speech. Do you want to say a little bit about it?
Oh, well, thank you very much for that, actually, Rafe. Yeah, it was about 6 weeks ago now, and the motion was that multiculturalism has no future in the UK. I was arguing basically that it doesn't have a future, but also it shouldn't have a future. It's been an utter disaster. What was interesting is obviously the audience were not on our side, but it wasn't anything like the wipeout that we thought it would be. I was doing it with Eric Kaufman, who's a great friend of this channel, and I think we lost, of course we knew we would, for I think it's 80 to 120. So they think there is a future for multiculturalism. But I think it's always an interesting experience to do these things because most of the young people in a very, very cloistered atmosphere. And so it was sort of rather invigorating, actually. I feel quite
That's how I used to feel every day when I went to work.
Yeah, well, quite. Yes, exactly. So, yes. Anyway, so do watch. It's interesting. First of all, the week has been dominated, obviously. Cliche coming up, but a week is a long time in politics. Last week on Friday, there was a Reform Party statement put out. I don't think I need to explain to you any of the details of basically what's been happening, between Rupert Lowe and Reform, Rupert Lowe and Nigel. Let's just start the ball off. Rafe, I mean, how serious is this? Because, look, it has to be said, we're on Twitter, we are doing these shows and watching similar shows. How sort of seriously does this balk for people?
Well, look, it goes without saying, I think, that for us here at the New Culture Forum, it's a very depressing episode. It's frustrating and it's infuriating in many ways. And I'm sure that most, if not all of our viewers will feel the same way. And probably most of them will side with Rupert Lowe in this argument on the principles that he stands for. But the reality is, and you're talking about what the wider impact will be, the long-term implications, is that very few people in the wider world have heard about Rupert Lowe. Within my family, I don't think anyone's ever heard of Rupert Lowe, even though some of them may be voting for the Reform Party. The latest polling that Matt Goodwin has put out has shown this in terms of asking the British public what their favourability and unfavourability are for Tice, for Anderson, for Lowe and for Farage. And actually 70% of the British public have no idea who Richard Tice and Anderson and Rupert Lowe are. whereas they all have an opinion on Nigel Farage. There are only 12% who are undecided or don't know who Nigel Farage is. That's the reality of the situation. So as big of an impact that Rupert Lowe's falling out with Nigel Farage has been on social media, as big as it is with those who are politically engaged, like our viewers are, the reality is that amongst the wider public, very little ripples will have come through. Very few people will be aware of it. That's a sad reality, I think, and I think people should know what's going on, because there's a fundamentally important question as to which direction reform is going in. Is it going to be a Tory party 2.0, a slightly more conservative party, which is far from what we need, or will it do what needs to be done? We are facing an existential crisis, and that requires a party that's able to take decisive, albeit controversial, action. So that's, I think, where we lie politically. I think the Rupert Lowe thing will blow over and will be forgotten, certainly by the time of the general election. There is talk, of course, about perhaps Rupert Lowe starting a new party, but again, I don't think there is any possibility of them becoming a viable force, because the British public as a whole only recognise Nigel Farage.
Hello, please excuse this brief interruption, but I'd be really grateful if you could please hit the subscribe button and subscribe to our channel. Our mission is vitally important, and we must grow this channel to ensure that our content reaches the biggest possible audience. The best way to do this is for you to subscribe. It's totally free. And in addition to subscribing, if you're able to donate or join our membership scheme, please click on the link in the description or visit our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. We've got great plans ahead, but we can't do it without your support. From only £4 per month, you'll receive a range of perks and benefits, including exclusive content. Thank you. Yeah, we'll come on to more about the party aspect, like new parties and things like that a bit later. But the thing is, you see, I totally understand this, but it seems to be there are 2 or 3 layers going on here. On the one hand, it's undeniable. This research, this study came out showing, as you say, that everyone knows Nigel, no one knows Rupert or anyone else for that matter. But I've been seeing it, I suppose, on a more kind of, as you say, political level.
Yeah.
What do they actually believe?
Yeah.
This is actually crucial, is it not? I mean,
well, in terms of the ideological differences between Rupert Lowe
well, yes, but also
Nigel
what
Farage.
do people think that reform believe in?
Well, I think most people, just general people in the general public, know what Nigel Farage stands for, that he's anti-immigration, he talks a lot about asylum seekers, he's against political correctness or woke, and he was Mr. Brexit. And I think for a lot of people, that's as deep as it goes. And they don't look into what the actual policy is or how he's going to do it. They just think he talks sense. When I hear him speak, I agree with him. And I might give him a vote. I used to give the Tories a vote, but they didn't really do much. So I'll give him my vote this time round. I think that is the case for a lot of people. I know in Westminster and political circles, we're very interested in policy and how they're going to achieve it. But I don't think politics works at that level for most people. Rightly or wrongly, I don't think it does.
Yeah, but one of the interesting things, if you are at all interested in politics, is this is a kind of a look behind the scenes, isn't it? Really, not just about 2 big egos clashing, which is, we know about that, and everybody's got their own opinion on that, and people think certain things about Nigel. Not many people know a lot of things about Rupert, but we're getting a sense of who Rupert is. But I think it's generally the sense of governance in the party, which seems to be quite alarming to me. It seems to be quite chaotic. And so one of the problems that Rupert Lowe has highlighted, and people like Ben Habib have followed up very, very strongly on this, is that there actually aren't really serious, deep, complex, well thought through policies here. It's very easy, I think, for people to say, well, we want to deport illegal immigrants, we want to deport foreign criminals and all of that kind of thing. And that's fine. Yeah, most people would agree with that. But one, how do you do it? That takes people sitting down in a small room. It's quiet work, it's thoughtful work, and it's serious work. It isn't sound bites in front of a television screen. And it isn't about rallies and conferences. It's very thoughtful, deep work. Is that going on? And it seems to me it isn't going on, or at least it isn't going on in the way that it should be. Because if it's okay to say, right, well, we want to deport A, B, C, and D, and we want to start conversations about remigration. That's interesting for some people, but how does that actually work? And how does reform respond when human rights lawyers start tearing it all apart and actually just throw it out? Have they got the answers for that?
Yeah.
That's absolutely correct, but I think it's a more fundamental issue because Nigel Farage does not want to mention deportations.
Indeed.
Does not want to mention remigration, right? I mean, this is one of the things that Nigel Farage openly said this recently, in an interview, that it was when Rupert began speaking about mass deportations, and he thought that was too much of a dark term to use. And
sorry, just do forget. I'm not talking about mass deportations. I'm talking about the kind of stuff that they've gone on record, and Nigel's gone on record about talking about before, which is just deporting criminals and that kind of thing.
Dual national.
Yeah, that whole idea of how do you actually go about that when you've got a lobby that is absolutely out to stop you? We know about that. How do you go about that way before you even get to mass deportation?
Because I think Rupert Lowe's resignation, or Rupert Lowe being defenestrated, has really brought to the fore this fissure, which, you come to a fork in the road, and are you going to go down the mass deportation route, or are you going to essentially become a slightly more conservative party, essentially carrying on what we saw for 14 years, but by being slightly more draconian? I mean, yes, they want to leave the ECHR, give them their credit. They want to deport dual nationals. There are things that make them much more conservative than the Conservative Party, but many of our views would say we're beyond that stage. We need to go a stage further. Now, I've been hoping for a long time that because credit to the Reform Party, they have now overtaken the Tory Party in the polls. They are level pegging with the Labour Party. That's thanks to Farage's strategy that they're doing. So obviously what they're doing is working with the mainstream British public. But there's no point in them getting elected if they're not going to do what needs to be done.
Exactly.
And so my only hope has been that they are basically doing a softy, catchy monkey routine, doing what Tony Blair did, perhaps doing a bit what Keir Starmer was doing, talking a centrist talk to the electorate. But then once you come into power, unveiling the draconian strategies that are necessary in order to do what needs to be done in terms of mass deportations and remigration. However, from what I've heard, that doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah.
There don't seem to be any of those policies there, in which case the question is, well, what is the point of reform?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, this is why. What's your instinct about that? Is this Ming vase being carried very gently over a polished floor thing?
I can understand it because Nigel Farage is a very competent and experienced politician, and I do think that we forget that outside of our circle, terms like mass deportation sound quite drastic to people, and people don't know what it means. They think, do they just want to get rid of all immigrants? Do they want to get rid of anybody that isn't white? It's alarming. So I do understand why Nigel Farage is maybe saying, well, let's be careful about the rhetoric we use. Now, I don't know what, he intends to do once he's in power. Maybe he will change. But the left are very good at this. They don't say what they're doing. They give it a nice kind of... They call it critical race theory or anti-racism or whatever. And actually what they want to do is very sinister, or their beliefs are very sinister. And I think we're too open and honest on the right. And
yeah, as you say we're open and honest. This is a very important point. Is that people say, oh yes, like you're saying, triangulate or whatever it might be called. But when you look at like Trump, or even like in Europe, Geert Wilders, they didn't trim their sails. In fact, if anything, they really went the whole hog, and it didn't put people off. The assumption in this whole argument is that somehow who are these people that are going to be suddenly turned off of reform?
I think Britain's very different from America. We just have a different sensibility here. And I think we just, I do understand. I can see both sides, to be honest. I can see the kind of free speech, be honest, say what you really believe. But I can also see the side that says, politics is the art of persuasion. It's the art of compromise, and we need to seem as reasonable as possible. We need to appeal to as many people as possible. So let's present our views in the most palatable way. I do think that is a serious consideration.
It is, but only if once they get into power, they're willing to
Yeah.
take the steps that are necessary. And that, I think, is the big question.
we don't know.
If we lend them our vote and they get into power, will they actually do the stuff that they won't say in public? Now, that's, what you're saying is perfectly fine. And look, what they're doing is working very well, and they have every reason to think they could form the next government because they're at 25% in the polls. You only need to have 32 to 33% to have a majority. Labour has a stonking majority of over 400 seats with only 1/3 of the votes, 33%. So reform could easily become the government by doing what it's doing. Will they do what needs to be done? Or they could actually bite the bullet and say we're going to go for mass deportations. Because, yes, it worked for Trump. We know for a fact that the average British voter is to the right of the average Tory MP on immigration. And I think 1/3 of the British electorate definitely would be supporting mass deportations and voluntary remigration. I think all those things would resonate with well over 1/3 of the public. So there are two ways to get into power. One would reassure us. The way that they're going doesn't reassure us and leaves us wondering what will happen if they get to power.
I agree, but I think you have to be serious about all of those things. And everything I'm seeing tells me that they're not that serious about that, because they should be making all of those plans now. They should be saying, okay, we know them quite well. They should be saying, well, we need to be thinking about this, this and this, because we are going down that route, even though we frame it this way. And I can understand what you've just said there, Amy, is absolutely true. I mean, when people think about mass deportations, people think about the National Front in the 1970s, they think about the British movement, they think about skinheads and all of that kind of thing. Of course, they don't want to be associated with that. And that is very much a British history, isn't it? That's British social history over the last 40 years or so. But maybe actually they should be communicating what they actually mean a lot clearer, and I don't really think they are. Again, it comes back to this thing about they're great at sound bites, Nigel's great at interviews, but I want substance. And I'm saying this as I hate this phrase, but you know what I mean, a critical friend, but a very disgruntled critical friend at the moment. I want more substance from them. It might be there. I might be missing it, but I just can't see it.
But let's be clear, when we're talking about mass deportations, we're talking about illegal immigrants. Criminals and illegal immigrants. That shouldn't be controversial. No. And then secondly, when we're talking about remigration, we're talking about voluntary remigration with financial incentives to leave the country, just as it's happening in Sweden. It's being considered by the Hungarians and the Finns and others, right? We know for a fact that the average immigrant in this country will cost £151,000 each by the time they get to retirement age. They'll cost £464,000 by the time they get to the age of 80. If you offer a naturalised citizen £30,000 to leave the country, and there are 5 of them, it makes economic sense for them, and it makes economic sense for us as well, as long as they renounce their citizenship. That's on a voluntary basis. So none of this should be seen as being terribly controversial or conjure up images of the far right or anything.
But again, it comes back to how they communicate that, don't they? And it seems to me that they are not talking about other things that would help them communicate that. For example, if they had a very clear and definite and detailed policy on culture, that would really help them. These things, it's like Lenin says, everything's connected to each other. Immigration is very much connected to culture and the impact on culture. So if they could communicate and articulate what they think about culture, then that would help them with the other narrative, which is arguably the central narrative.
The thing about this whole debacle, though, is that the very kind of talented people that you would want to draw into the party that would be good at writing policy are now going to be put off by seeing the way that people are treated, in such an underhand, cutthroat way. Any man or woman who is a professional and is successful, they're going to think, well, I'm not going to go near that because, if I say the wrong thing, I'll have an allegation against me, it'll be in the press. So that is, to me, it has been mishandled in a very bad way. And that's I'm a bit angry at Nigel Farage for that, because it means that Nigel Farage, the Reform Party, are going to have difficulty growing, I think, now.
Well, no, look, I mean, it's absolutely it. So, in a way, we're getting up, talking more about realpolitik now and personalities, but it's always been a feature, that it's very much a one man band. That was okay for Brexit because essentially it was one message. No one really cared what we thought about other things. It was one message: we want to come out of the EU. And when you have that, you can then really, almost effortlessly bring on board people like, as far away as Claire Fox and Douglas Carswell.
Yeah. I mean,
but you can't do this on this sort of thing.
No.
But the point being is you need talent, as you say. And the fact is that whenever there have been people who are very, very good, somehow they come to grief, when it's Nigel involved. I mean, the fact is when you have, you talk about, being clear, even before you get to the ins and outs and the nitty-gritty, we don't even really, no one could explain to you what this zero net migration is. Yeah. Still, could you? I mean, in a way, it's sort of almost taking advantage of people's sheer desperation to have something else. They just say, well, of course they're going to be stronger on migration. But actually, the way it stands at the moment with this net zero migration, actually that doesn't mean that at all, does it? It's just replacing some people with another lot of people.
I think people just hope that once they get into power, things will change. I mean, I guess that's what I think as well. But they do need to work on policy. Like I said, they need to get people in. But I don't know. But it's so hard, isn't it? Because, if someone's too talented, it seems as though they get the chop. So how do you build a team? It doesn't. It does seem to be that Nigel Farage isn't a team player. I think that's coming through a bit. It's changed my opinion of him, this whole thing. I'd probably still vote for Reform. I still think he'd be very good. But on a personal level, I was quite shocked by how he went about things with Rupert Lowe.
Well, of course, because this Zia Yusuf fellow, the chairman, party chairman, is an unknown quantity to most people, isn't he? And indeed to us too. I mean, suddenly there's this guy here, and apparently, a lot of people see him as being the nub of the problem. I mean, who knows? I mean, a lot of this is kind of guesswork. I think that the main thing is that I don't think this would have been such a thing if people were not so kind of conflicted and confused about the general messages.
Exactly.
Go right back, as you mentioned, Steve Edgerton, about deportations. I was more struck by the one on the Winston Marshall show when he said, look, the way things are going in this country demographically, we cannot, if we take on political Islam, then we will lose. And I just sort of thought, oh dear. If that is kind of triangulation, Blairite triangulation, then I don't like the sound of it.
And it's so significant because this is not like a typical party squabble, because such a huge element of the British population are hanging all of their hopes on the reform. They see reform as the last gasp, the last hope for this country. And they have got such high expectations. And if it turns out to be a damp squib, it'll be yet another betrayal of the British public. They were betrayed by Boris over Brexit, who brought in more. This will be yet another betrayal. And you think, how many times can the British people be betrayed? But having said all of that, look, there are only three contenders to form the next government: Labour, Conservative and Reform. And by every measure, the Reform Party is much more deserving of power than those other two. The policies that Reform have, even though they may not be the ones we want to have, they're still far better than the policies of, they're committed to leaving the ECHR. They've committed to reducing immigration. I mean, on lots of levels, there's every reason to vote for them over the other two parties. They are the only game in town, so the vote should still go to them. But there's just every pressure must be put on them to actually understand that we are facing an existential crisis and they need to actually do what needs to be done.
Yes, I mean, that's the point, really, which I think that either Ben Habib or Rupert Lowe have made this week, it's the enormity of the crisis. Is there a real appreciation of that? I mean, like we're talking about national survival, and there's a sense of urgency. We have a sense of urgency, I think you'd agree. I mean, we're thinking of time. Time is ticking away.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, 2029 or whenever the next election will be, it's always later than you think, okay? And we are much nearer than that, than we think we are. This broke on, when did it break? On Friday. We texted each other on Friday afternoon, and all of a sudden it feels like we've been in this forever, and it's only a few days later. My worry is that if this does continue to grow and grow and grow, in some respects, I suppose it feels a bit like a very big family squabble at the centre of it. But the ramifications, as you say, are just massive. And if this grows and grows and grows, it feels as though all of that hope that we've all had for the last few months since the election, it just feels as though it's just going to evaporate overnight. And then I'm not saying it's going to.
No.
I'm not saying it's going to, but there is a huge danger here. I suppose I'm just amplifying what Rafe has just said. There is a huge danger here. And if that happens, then many people are going to be absolutely devastated. And I don't really talk in those terms when I'm talking about politics, but I think it's appropriate here because so many people are so invested in this little party.
I think that there is a sense of dismay. I mean, I was talking to in our locals. If you're watching now and you're in one of our locals groups, did a little brief survey, and people actually say, this kind of, oh dear, not again. There's that feeling. What I don't understand is this, or should I say, can I have your comments on? I think I do understand. If you're in a situation like that and there's a kind of bubbling kind of problem, which is along the lines of, someone's being too hardline or whatever it is, in this case, Rupert Lowe, wouldn't you just do it? Wouldn't you just go in and say, look, for these very reasons, we can't demoralise people. So we'll just kind of come on, grit our teeth and pretend we're friends or something.
Yeah,
Wouldn't you think?
I feel frustrated by all of them airing their dirty laundry all over Twitter and having these spats via media articles. You do feel, could you not just got together and sorted it out? It's really demoralising for everyone. And even Rupert Lowe, I think he's a great politician, but he did criticise Nigel in this media article, and you think, did you have to do that openly? I don't. It just seems as though it started off something and then they were all wading on each other. Everybody was criticising everyone. And it's just not a good look, is it? And you just think, I don't understand that these are all kind of quite serious professional men. Could they not have just sorted this out? It's if you really, as you say, if you really do think everything is at stake here, you should be saying to each other, look, it's not about us. It's not personal. Let's sort this out for the good of the party and for the good of the country,
I just think, possibly that was the situation 2 months ago, and maybe he's just absolutely at the end of his tether. Maybe he just cannot communicate. And I do think it comes back down to governance. It comes back down to the structures of the party and how it's run. And I've said this before on this show. I don't have confidence in that complexity and the communication networks. It seems to be Nigel and maybe a WhatsApp group, and that's pretty much it. This is a party we are pinning our hopes on to govern the country, and if they cannot actually just, as Rupert said, look, let's just go out to dinner together and sort this out. It seems as though it's way, way past that. Well, it's gone.
It is.
Gone. It's completely gone. Yeah. But, if a week ago, if they couldn't do that, then it seems as though that's really alarming because, as I say, this is a party who we want to govern the country. They can't even communicate with each other.
Yeah. Before we leave this on topic, doubtless it will come back very soon. Do you think that there would be any hope for some new venture? I mean, just supposing this happens. I mean, supposing Rupert, and in fact it's sort of been alluded to already, hasn't it? I don't know whether it's a he said, she said thing, but if Rupert and Ben got together...
I can't see it happening simply because, look at Reform. Reform only surged when Nigel Farage took it over again. Love him or loathe him, Farage is the only contender to become a Prime Minister. He's the only person who has engagement with the public. Look, I would probably cleave much more to another party's perspectives and so forth. It's not a realistic option, much as it pains me to say that, in any hopes of forming a next government. And we're at that point where we have to think seriously about, this is existential crisis time. We haven't got the time to start building up another party, which will take years before it becomes a viable option. There has to be some way to actually get Reform to actually commit or promise to do stuff when they get into power. That seems to me the only way, because only Nigel has the ability to become a Prime Minister for everybody on the right, unless Jenrick in some way comes into Reform or becomes the new leader of the Tory party and does some great sort of, root and branch reform of it. I think Jenrick is the only other person apart from Farage who could pose a significant challenge.
Yeah, I think it really is about personalities and it's about profile, because if it were about policies, just about policies, then all you have to do is actually look at the SDP, and they've got all the socially conservative policies very well thought out and all the rest of it, and that, you know, it pains me to say, but they've got no chance. So it is about these big figures, and I think without Nigel, I think you're right. I don't think there probably is a future.
Yes, I think yes. You talk about generic. I mean, you know, maybe that's a whole different program, but in fact, you know, you could have this nascent Tory party suddenly making a turn.
I've seen in interviews.
You know, he's been outflanking, hasn't he?
He has, and in interviews that I've seen recently with Rupert Lowe, he's quite favourable about the Tories. He talks about being a Tory all his life, and he seems to be leaving it quite open for the possibility of him joining the Tory party, which means with Rupert Lowe and Jenrick, you would then have those two of them would be acting as a sort of pressure group on reform in a way, because they are probably both to the right of Farage. So you could it could sort of flip and go the other direction, where the Tories might take
Well,
it.
actually, I think they would upend reform.
But,
Yeah,
but
they
let's
would.
be clear here, the Tories is not the vehicle. The Tory party needs to die. The Tory party's had its day. We can't give it another chance to sell us out again. So Jenrick ideally would come over to reform, or something would happen, or there'd be a hostile takeover of the Tory party by the Reform Party. But the number of wets in the Tory party, then the way that they select their MP candidates, who are all essentially Lib Dems, there's no hope there. So even if you had Jenrick as the leader, you know, he wouldn't be carried along by his parliamentary party as it's currently constituted. But
Before we go on to things, there's just one more. It's like a slight cul-de-sac, slight digression. But you're talking about feeling dismayed about all of these things going on. At the same time, I don't know whether you felt this, but there was a certain dismay I felt, a sort of ennui, maybe, over Trump, dare I say it. I don't know whether you know what I mean, but I was sort of feeling, oh dear, this, you know, so much hope put in this, and yet somehow or other, all this stuff you're doing you're handling it wrong. I'm talking to Trump. And I just got a slight feeling of I'm rather tired of the kind of antics. I know that, you know, I just want an adult there. And look, let's face it, we were just absolutely going on about how wonderful it was, weren't we, with Trump? And all the executive directives going out and all of that. But I sort of felt, you know, particularly with Canada and this kind of talk of 51st state, what's this about, you know, and the Zelensky thing as well, you know.
and Greenland and all this. A lot of trolling, just unnecessary trolling.
Yeah.
Calling the Prime Minister of Canada governor as if he was the governor of the, you know, the 51st state. You know, and of course, Trump doesn't want Canada to become the 51st state, because that would be like importing another California.
Yes.
And that would ensure that the Republicans would never get elected, because the Canadians overwhelmingly would vote for the Democrats. It's pure trolling in order to get some negotiation advantages in the future, and yet so much goodwill is being lost by that. And most importantly, for Conservatives, we've now seen, you know, there was a 25-point lead for the Canadian Conservatives over the Liberals. Now they may not even win the next election, you know, so there's been such a huge change. We may see that here with Reform and Farage as well. There's every reason to expect there may be a bust-up between America and Australia now, because in the Australian-American Free Trade Agreement, there are no tariffs on steel. So you may get another issue there with Conservatives in Australia. So I think, you know, the closest allies, the Five Eyes, they're actually getting the worst deal out of all of this, it seems.
Yes, it's kind of, it makes you feel, oh, you know, the world turns, you know, and yeah, so here we are again. You know, that's how I sort of tend to feel.
I think that feeling is amplified because of what's going on here, actually, and that sense of when you look at Trump and you look at how he speaks and how he acts, I mean, he is essentially a rogue businessman, isn't he? You know, I mentioned last week, I think, Goodfellas and The Godfather, but I'm also thinking about Gordon Gekko. You know, he's almost that kind of character, isn't he? And we're not used to that in politics. We're not used to these, you know, these big beasts going and being so incredibly aggressive. And carnivorous almost. So yeah, it does feel as though none of that's helping at the moment, and it almost feels as though we just want to settle. And I suppose this is my big point about reform. They need to settle. They need to be quiet. They need to think rather than just speaking all the time. And that idea of actually taking time to understand what you're doing rather than just pushing forward no matter what is, I suppose, links to that for me.
Well, I think one other issue, in fact, came up this week as some statistics came out, which actually do illustrate quite how deep some of these issues are and the problem. In this case of immigration, I mean, this was to do with crime, and then there was also a housing one.
Yeah, so this was the Centre for Migration Studies. They submitted a freedom of access request to the Ministry of Justice, obtained data around nationality and crime. And I mean, we covered this in our Heresies documentary, but it showed, it showed kind of what we were expecting, that 1 in 4 sexual offences in this country are committed by migrants, which means that migrants are 70% more likely to commit sexual offences than British nationals. Right. If you break it down, you see that Afghanistan and Eritrea are the 2 top nationalities that are committing these crimes. So it's non-European.
Sex crime towards women.
Towards women. So it's non-European, Middle Eastern and African men that are committing these crimes. If you look at the rates of highly violent sexual offences, you see that men from the Congo are more likely to commit highly violent sexual offences, which is as you'd expect, because the Congo is has some of the highest rates of violent sexual assaults in the world. And then if you look at other crimes, just like drug-related crimes or theft or various other crimes, you see that migrants are, committing these crimes far higher than British nationals. It's kind of what we all knew, but I guess when you see it in kind of the statistics, it's quite, it just brings it home again. And as I said, we covered it in our Heresies documentary, and it's just shocking to see that it's happening. And it's very worrying for the future of the country, because these problems are just going to get bigger.
What about the housing thing?
So this was something that Matt Goodwin has spoken about. He did quite a good job of promoting the statistic that in London, just under 50% of social housing is taken up by migrants. But he's actually shown recently that across the UK, like in England, places like Luton, Birmingham, Leicester, Oldham, most notably, these are a lot of places where there have been grooming gangs, that social housing is taken up by migrants to an alarming rate of up to 70%. And that these are people that are often on benefits. He's shown that 4 out of 10 homes that are social housing owned by migrants cannot speak English. So these are just people that are absolutely not contributing anything, can't speak our language, taking benefits, taking taxpayers' money for social housing, contributing nothing. And when you see it kind of laid out, he put these images on Twitter showing kind of the parts where it's covered up by social housing taken up by migrants. When you see the images, you think, gosh, this is a different country. You start to we've been talking about English identity, then you start to think, well, is the English language even going to be our kind of main language? I mean, you start getting you can start getting quite worked up, but you think, gosh, this is so...
We don't do that on this show, as you well know.
But it is terrifying.
It feels as though the image you're talking about was an infographic, wasn't it, of where all of these things are. And when you look at these things, it feels like everything's falling apart, and it feels like things don't work. And just to return to those statistics that you were talking about, which was the Centre for Migration Control, I think, published these this week. There were over 500,000 sexual assaults reported, offences reported. Guess how many of those actually ended up in conviction? Just 3.1%. 3.1%. So again, it's that idea that nothing's working. This society isn't functioning. And if society isn't functioning, very, very quickly things fall apart. And very quickly women and children become the victims of that society.
Were you in any way surprised? Actually, there was another set of statistics. We don't have to go into all the numbers. But alongside social housing, there was one about private renting in I believe, London, which again showed the most extraordinary level of foreign renting. I mean, majority, I think. I mean, it's still, when you look at it and you look at these diagrams, these are different countries taking root within one country.
And
Different societies.
British houses for British people. It's not, it's too hard to ask for that basic thing, given the levels of crisis we have with housing for British people. People have been on waiting lists for years, then they're piggybacked over by someone who's arrived here recently. People have no connection to an area. It doesn't seem as if in any political party that simply had that as one of its campaign slogans, British houses for British people, surely would have a huge amount of support coming over to them. But the crime statistics I find absolutely even more fascinating, because we were getting to a point where we saw a great drop amongst the indigenous population in violent crime and so forth. One reason being people drink less, and so you go out less. So you're getting less. Most violence occurs around the pubs and nightclubs, and because that was declining, we were getting to a point actually where we were going to become an extremely peaceful society until we imported in these vast numbers, and it's amazing. Afghans and Eritreans are more than 20 times more likely to be convicted for say sex crimes. But then if you look at drug crimes, foreign nationals are 69% more likely than Brits to be convicted for drug crimes, 25% more likely to be convicted for theft, and 39% more likely to be convicted for all crimes. And then you look at the Vietnamese, the Somalis, the Afghans, the Eritreans. We have a top 10 list of countries. And I'm just reminded of what Donald J. Trump Jr. said when he said, if I offer you a bowl of M&Ms and I tell you that some of them are poisoned, are you going to take a handful? No, of course not. So why are we importing people from these countries?
Thing is, you see, with these, is sometimes it shows you how things have shifted. Because for quite a long time, for decades, you could not say that there was any differential in crime. Oh, what are you talking about? There are good and bad in every, And this completely blows it out of the water. But you see, come back to my point about reform, without wishing to drag it all up again. But when you see the level of crisis that there is there, this is why one becomes so, needful of some kind of strong stance and strong statement. And which is not what somehow we are getting at the moment.
It all comes down to trust at the end of the day. And we used to have a high trust society, and now that is just completely destroyed. And it's completely destroyed because we've had 30 years of mass immigration. What we want in our political parties is high trust. We want to be able to trust them. We want them to do what they say they're going to do. Now, the Tory party have not done that. We've had them for 50 years. They never did that. We were in a gaslighting, narcissistic relationship with them where they pretty much abused us. The problem we've got now with reform, and again, I don't want to go on about it, but can we trust reform now? And it seems, at least to be sensible and at least to be organised. And for me, it feels as though we can't.
Also, another thing that actually might have broken down some of that trust, is, I don't know whether you've noticed, but this week people have been reminiscing, not in a nice way necessarily, about the beginning of the whole pandemic. Yeah. I know you wrote something about it online, actually, didn't you? It is 5 years. Can you believe? And here we are, March 2025. So 5 years ago, I remember standing in a bar, as you do, near where I was living at the time in Woolwich, and everyone was watching Boris Johnson on the TV, closing everything down, basically. And so we were there for the last time as free sort of people. What's your sort of vignette that you remember? Stands up.
Well, first of all, this is for viewers. This is a reminiscence, isn't it? This is a kind of national reminiscence that started last Sunday. COVID, the lockdown changed my life. I've got a completely different life to the life I had before, and a lot of that is down to the ramifications, the fallout of lockdown. For me, I lived in a place called Chapel Allerton. I don't live there now. I lived in a place called Chapel Allerton in Leeds, and it was extremely woke. It was public sector. It was very chattering class, and my main memory of that was people banging on pots and pans maniacally worshipping this god of the NHS. And every night or every Thursday, whenever it was, they were doing that. And afterwards, I heard that the whole street was whispering about me because I didn't do that. But the memory I have is linked to what happened afterwards, because people went crazy about this, didn't they? First of all, it was BLM, and then everybody was locked down for however long it was. And then everybody just started going activist crazy. It was trans, it was the environment, and now it's Hamas. And all of that, I think, comes from the craziness of being locked down. So for me, my memory is that, and moving away from that place, and actually moving away in lots of ways from that old life.
Well, there you go. But Emmy, it's noticeable, is it not, how people don't really talk about what was an extraordinarily massive era-defining thing. People don't talk about it.
No, it's interesting. I think there's so many injustices, and things got so insane that people want to just kind of wipe it from their memory, I think, a little bit. I mean, for me, I was working in the NHS when all of this was happening.
Were you doing those dances and everything?
No, I wasn't. No, and I wasn't doing the pots or the pans or anything. I can say now without feeling frightened, but I did for a long time was being made to feel like I was an evil person, but I didn't have the vaccine. And I was being threatened with the sack for not having the vaccine, and I got pulled in by my... Yeah, I know. I got pulled in by my manager, and I was looked at like I was evil, and I was told you're going to have a few meetings and then you'll be out. And
so
then
it was life-changing for you as well.
For me, it was. Yeah. And it was horrible. And then and I could kind of sense the things things were going politically, and I was thinking they can't do this because it's actually going to be illegal and it's going to cause them all sorts of problems. So when they came out and said, actually, we're not going to do mandatory vaccinations, I was obviously very relieved. And then the NHS, like my manager and everybody, just went quiet. I didn't get an email saying, so sorry, we're not going to sack you, you don't have to have a meeting. It just went quiet. And then you never really heard about boosters or vaccines again. And then you just think, well, hang on a minute, 6 months ago, we were being told you have to have boosters every 6 months or you're an evil person. Yeah. And then suddenly it was like, that's over now. And it was so bizarre, and it was such a strange situation, and it totally changed my opinion of the NHS and how I related to it. Obviously, all the woke stuff and everything else that I was going through changed that as well. But you just saw how so many people, there's so many mad things, that people being in a room together and wearing masks, even though they're at the other end of the room together. And you know that it's stupid, and yet you were being forced to do it. I changed my view of, not just of the NHS actually, but of people in general. They're just human beings. I sort of suddenly saw people differently, that I just couldn't believe so many people could go along with this madness. So it changed me, and it changed my view of people in a quite drastic way.
Do you think, Rafe, people, like, one of the reasons they don't talk about it is because they're vaguely ashamed in some way of like what they went along with, or not? Because polls come out, don't they, and show actually quite a large proportion of people would happily do it again, even now.
The majority of the British population would go into lockdown tomorrow if they thought that it was necessary, having learnt none of the lessons. Yes, I'm sure some people are embarrassed and ashamed by positions. You've had people like, what's his name, Piers Morgan, apologising for his strident views that he held before. I think many people are just so sick and want to just forget about this nightmarish period. But it did, we always proudly used to say an Englishman's rights and life and liberty, and this idea of an Englishman's home being his castle, all these concepts all thrown into question by that. Suddenly we realised actually the Englishman's cleaving to liberty and independence somehow were exposed as being something belonging to a previous generation. Yeah. Madeline Grant, the sketch writer for The Telegraph, her moment, and she reminded me, her moment was when that money-grubbing daughter of Captain Tom Moore was made to stand in the royal box at Wimbledon, receiving a rapturous round of applause from everybody at Wimbledon. And given what we now know about her since then, this goes to show the level of inanity. But for me, it was, I broke my ankle during COVID and was bedbound for 2 or 3 months.
Actually, didn't you come in here in a wheelchair?
And then I was in a wheelchair and everything else. So, but I remember being wheeled to Oxford Circus because I wanted to see what London was like during lockdown. This sort of 28 days later scenario where the streets are deserted as if there was a zombie apocalypse, and being wheeled and left in the middle of Oxford Circus for a few seconds. with no traffic whatsoever. It was a surreal moment, and I really enjoyed that aspect of appreciating the beauty, but then thinking, gosh, how do we come back from this?
Yeah, that was the thing. It was, on the one hand, sort of beautiful to feel you were in the Victorian city. But on the other hand, I didn't like the reasons why we were feeling that. You know,
It was eerie.
it was very, very eerie.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, as you say about that, that's one of the things that stuck with me. This idea that we've got a truculent belief in our liberty, the level of petty officialdom on such a big scale, and particularly amongst young people.
Yeah.
I mean, I felt that I was in a foreign country. I felt that I was in a foreign country. In fact, when I was, in fact, in a foreign country, that's one of my main memories. It's linked to that. I was in an airport, and I have a witness because he was with me. But
That's
in
right.
fact, yes,
That's right, yeah.
in Greece, and there was this maniac security man who
He
took
was actually an official, wasn't he?
Yes, he took exception to the fact that I think we walked in without a mask on, and he came right in, you know, in your face like this, and I really thought we were going to have a fight, because I just was shouting back to him, and it was like that. I think you said you thought I was going to lay him out at one point. I felt so angry.
Leave him, he's not worth it.
I just didn't want to spend the night in a Greek jail. I believe they're not very nice.
No, don't you remember?
I remember it vividly, yeah.
But the depressing thing about this whole incident was when we went back into the queue of all English people.
Yeah. Everybody was tutting at us.
Yes, you would think that just you'd look a little bit of camaraderie. Something if someone turned to you and sort of said, "Oh mate, no, it's stupid, isn't it? Anyway, you got to do it," or something like that. They looked away. They didn't want to know, and you suddenly thought, "No, these people are not the people I thought they were."
And I just to finish that point, I felt at home where I lived. I felt such an outsider because I wasn't part, and it was really the first time living there, because all of a sudden everything became public, everything became on the street, even though we weren't allowed to step onto the street. It felt as though politics was absolutely in your face, and it was one of those places. It was very chattering class, and now I believe they're all pro-Hamas. You know, so I'm glad I moved away in a way.
You're very
Interesting, isn't it? Because there have been three great divisions. The Scottish referendum divided Scotland. We got Brexit, and then we got COVID. And and what COVID did is it also divided the right. And you see, you know, people like David Starkey and Peter Hitchens lost a huge number of supporters just because they took the vaccine for whatever reason they took it. So suddenly you got that divide, and anything else that Starkey now says or Hitchens says, well, you took the vaccine, I'm not going to listen to you, and so forth. And it just seems as if this was a needless, again, another divide on the right, which we didn't need to have, all caused by COVID.
Also, there were some people who, like, are really well thought of now on immigration, like Neil O'Brien, who used to be Politics Exchange, I believe, and he did a very successful report on immigration, last year. But he was one of the main ringleaders when it came to the whole pandemic thing, and like going off on the head banging right, as we would call it. Well, we carried on here. We carried on. You know, we used to come in by taxis and things like that, and we carried on. Anyway, there you go. Well, 5 years ago, let's hope, never again. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rafe. Thank you very much, Amy. We're actually going to carry on just one more item. So become a member, and then you can see it. And we shall see you otherwise next week. Have a good week, won't you? Bye. Our mission at the New Culture Forum is and always has been to defend and celebrate Britain's history, culture, and its people, and indeed Western civilization, at a time when both are under sustained attack. We have grown from small beginnings to become the country's most influential right-leaning cultural think tank. Our content is watched and read by some of Britain's most influential political figures. But now, we need your help. If you believe in what we do, then please do become a member. For as little as £4 a month, you can make a vital contribution to what we do. As a member of the NCF family, you will help ensure that we can continue to produce quality content online, such as our 3 weekly programs, Whittle, which is our flagship interview show, Newspeak, our panel discussion show, and Deprogrammed, which is targeted at Britain's youth. As you probably know, in addition, we produce important documentaries, such as our critically acclaimed 6-part series, The West, a stunning celebration of the history and genius of Western civilization, and our ongoing documentary series, Heresies, with hard-hitting episodes tackling subjects such as immigration, gender ideology, and BBC bias. But the New Culture Forum is much more than a YouTube channel. We don't just complain about Britain as it is, we provide real solutions and clear policies on how we can push back against the madness and restore sanity to this nation. Our presenters are now highly sought after and have become familiar faces across the media. Our prestigious annual Smith Lecture and our regional and indeed national conferences have attracted world-class speakers. Perhaps most importantly, we are the only organisation on the right of politics that has launched a national movement without actually being a political party. And uniquely, through our NCF Locals programme, we've established some 30 active branches in towns and cities right across the nation, from Edinburgh to Exeter, and with many more on the way. We're very proud of what we've achieved, and our members have made it possible. In return, our members receive access to exclusive content, invitations to private events, free or discounted tickets to our conferences and lectures, free copies of our books, and much more. I very much hope that you'll join us too by clicking the link in the description or going to our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Now is the time that we need your help. Thank you.